Good morning, everybody. My name is Miranda Peterson, and I'm a policy advisor in the personal office of Congressman Frank Pallone from New Jersey. Thank you all for joining us, part of the Coastal Community Caucus today for this really spectacular panel that we have put together for you on American coastal success and the public trust doctrine. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. I want to tell you about the Coastal Communities Caucus. The CCC is a bipartisan group of members who meet to discuss the unique concerns of those who live, work, and do business along America's 95,000 miles of coast, including the Great Lakes, Pacific, Atlantic, Gulf, and island states and territories. Over 129 million Americans live on these coasts, 54.6 million of whom are employed by coastal counties that produce $10 trillion in goods and services. That doesn't sound like success to you. I don't know what does. But key to that success is the premise of the public trust doctrine. So right now we're in a pretty important time, and we're going to be learning more about it from our panel, from its establishment in ancient Roman law to its use in tackling challenges making headlines today. We're going to learn about the public trust doctrine and how the federal government uses it to work with states, territories, and tribes to care for coastal communities via the Coastal Zone Management Act. So now I'm going to kick it over to, one last thing before I kick it over to Stephanie. At the end of this, we hope you will stay tuned for a question and answer section with our panelists. And then we're going to do a new segment, which we started with our last event, where any members or participants are you can unmute yourself or drop into the Teams chat information on any bipartisan or hoping to make it bipartisan bills, letters, other initiatives, or things that your boss is working on that has to do with coastal communities. So please stay tuned for that. And now I will kick it over to Stephanie Otts, Director of the National Sea Grant Law Center based at the University of Mississippi. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for this briefing titled American Coastal Success and the Public Trust Doctrine. We have a really informative session planned for you today with three wonderful panelists: Erin Ryan, law professor at Florida State University; Christine Goebel with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality; and Jill Andrews with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. And all of our panelists will provide more background as we turn over the presentations to them. So we're here today to highlight the connections between the public trust doctrine and successful coastal management. And as Erin will discuss in a minute, the public trust doctrine is a legal principle establishing that coastal lands and waters are held by the states in trust to be managed for public benefit. And across the country, the application of the public trust doctrine has preserved and expanded public access rights to waterfronts and beaches, supporting culturally and economically important fishing, recreation, and tourism industries. The public trust doctrine holds state governments accountable for responsible stewardship of trust resources, providing a firm foundation for state coastal management laws and policies that seek to protect, for example, coastal wetlands and other critical habitats. And so whether it's beach access in New Jersey and Texas, surface and groundwater protection in California, or working waterfront preservation in Maine and Florida, the public trust doctrine really is a critical tool in the coastal management toolbox that helps ensure that our coastal communities remain vibrant and are able to meet the needs of current and future residents and visitors. So with that brief introduction, I'm excited to turn it over to Erin Ryan to give us some historical and other background on the public trust doctrine.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. And it's such thank you for the invitation to be part of this important conversation. It's a great honor to help inform our legislative process as we work together to protect our treasured natural resources and coastal resources. I am so committed that I am coming to you actually from China right now, where I am teaching environmental policy and marine resources management at the Ocean University of China. But my role in today's program is to set the table for my co-panelists' more specific presentations by giving you a quick and dirty introduction to the public trust doctrine itself, the legal principle and its historical development in the United States. And I'll be drawing from my forthcoming book on the subject, Law for the Land. Slide, please. But I've been asked to also let you know that my interest in this subject is both personal as well as professional, because I learned about the public trust doctrine as a federal worker, a U.S. Forest Service ranger serving in the Mono Lake district of the Inyo National Forest just east of Yosemite. And learning about the public trust doctrine is what inspired me to go to law school. So it's with great pleasure I can now help us think about it with the perspective of both a federal forest ranger and a seasoned law professor. Slide, please. So let's go ahead and talk about the law. The first thing I want to do is make sure that we're all on the same page with the core idea at the heart of the doctrine, this public trust principle, which is that some natural resources are so valuable to everyone that they can't belong to just anyone. So they have to be managed by the sovereign for the benefit of all the people, who in turn get to hold the state accountable to these obligations in court. And so what we see here in the public trust principle is the partnering of a sovereign obligation, an express sovereign obligation to protect trust resources, combined with an implicit public right to the benefit of those resources and to hold the state accountable to its obligations in court. Next slide, please. It is one of the oldest doctrines of American common law. It comes to us from thousands of years ago in ancient Roman law, where the jus publicum principle was codified this way. By natural law, these things are the common property of all, the air, the running water, the sea, and with it the shores of the sea. And that idea was received into British common law and then US common law, where it is most uniformly applied to navigable waterways. Slide, please. But if we look at the history, slide, please. Yes, if we look at the history of the doctrine over time, we see that it applied to a wider variety of common pool natural resources than just water. The Justinian Code I just quoted applied to the air. In the Magna Carta, the seat of Western democracy, it was applied to all forest resources. And then later in British common law, it applied to tidelands. In the 19th century, when US courts began thinking about the doctrine, it was extended from tidelands to all navigable waterways, including our Great Lakes and rivers. In the 20th century, in the Mono Lake case, the Audubon Society case that I referenced, the same principle was affirmed to also apply to environmental values of navigable waterways. And today, in the 20th century, we see environmental advocates attempting to apply the same partnering of principles to protect the atmospheric commons against climate change. So what we see over this history is a doctrine evolving from one of sovereign authority over public trust resources to a doctrine of responsibility to protect them, and a limit on sovereign power enforceable by the citizens in court. Next slide, please. So here we have the classic American statement of the doctrine from the US Supreme Court in 1892. The state holds the title to the lands under navigable waters in trust for the people of the state, that they may enjoy the navigation of the waters, carry on commerce over them, and have liberty of fishing therein freed from the obstruction or interference of private parties. There it is, the public trust principle, sovereign obligation to protect trust resources, and public rights to the benefit and enforcement of the trust. And just to show you how powerful, next slide, please, to show you how powerful that public right is, let me give you the facts of the case I just quoted in a nutshell, Illinois Central Railroad. In 1869, the state legislature of Illinois gave Chicago Harbor to a private railroad. The people were not delighted. They promptly threw the bums out who made this decision. A new legislature was put in place. They promptly repealed the conveyance. Now the railroad was not delighted, and litigation ensued. And you can probably imagine what the railroad said. Their argument was something to the effect of, no backseas. You can't just give us this valuable natural resource and take it back like nothing ever happened. All sorts of legal problems with that. But the state defended the lawsuit on grounds of the public trust doctrine. They said, Lake Michigan, Chicago Harbor, is a navigable waterway. It may have looked like the bums we just threw out gave you this body of water, but that was impossible. That was ultra vires, beyond state power. So no problem. There never was a gift, therefore no harm, no foul, and the Supreme Court accepted that reasoning. Slide, please. The same principle has now been constitutionalized in many state constitutions. For example, here's mine in Florida. The title to lands under navigable waters within the boundaries of the state is held by the state. by virtue of its sovereignty and trust for all the people. It looks a lot like Illinois Central. But some states have taken a more modern, more expansive vision of public trust principles. Here's Pennsylvania's constitution. The people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. Next slide, please. In the 20th century, I mentioned this important case, the Mono Lake case, Audubon Society, which really was an inflection point in the development of the doctrine as a tool of environmental law. In this case, environmental plaintiffs sued the state of California for statutorily permitting water rights that would allow the city of Los Angeles to export water from this lake, Mono Lake, the eastern watershed of Yosemite National Park, to the point of its near extinction. And when they sued on grounds that the public trust doctrine prevented this, the California Supreme Court in 1983 agreed and said, yeah, this is like giving away Chicago Harbor. This is beyond state authority. It cannot be done, notwithstanding the statutory water rights. And moreover, it affirmed that the doctrine applied to protect the ecological, environmental, recreational, and scenic values associated with public trust waterways. Next slide, please. From the Mono Lake case forward, the doctrine expanded quickly across the United States. And at this point, it's a good time to recognize that rather than referring to the American public trust doctrine, it's probably more accurate to refer to the 50 public trust doctrines, because it's developed slightly differently among all the states. They all start with the same core public trust principle that I introduced at the beginning of our conversation, but they have evolved along some very marked lines. They operate in different forms of law. Different values are protected by the doctrine in different states. Different resources are protected. There are even different legal theories about the nature of the doctrine. And so for my last few minutes, I'm going to give you a quick tour of some of the variety of the doctrine across the United States. Next slide, please. The first thing, different forms of law, we've already met. We see that sometimes it operates as a common law doctrine, as in the Illinois Central Railroad case and the Mono Lake case. We've seen it in constitutional law, Pennsylvania's constitution, for example. Some states have adopted statutory versions of the trust, such as Minnesota and Oregon. Some states, there has been executive use of the trust, famously in Michigan, and in other examples, if we had more time, we could talk about them. Some states, we see it across multiple branches of government. Next slide, please. We also see different values being protected by the trust in different states. They all start with the core protection of traditional navigational values for transportation, commerce, and fishing. But increasingly, we see protection for recreational and aesthetic values associated with trust resources like swimming and kayaking, walking around the Great Lakes, recreational access, and beauty. Some states, like Virginia, in its constitution, protect cultural and historic values. And after the Mono Lake case, increasingly express protection for environmental values, like we've seen in California and Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. Different states also protect different resources. Everyone starts with state management of submerged lands, but increasingly states are protecting other water resources. California recently extended its public trust to protect groundwater tributaries of navigable waterways. Michigan protects the water quality of the Great Lakes. Some states protect other natural resource commons that are also susceptible to appropriation or monopoly. Oregon protects fish and wildlife under its doctrine. As we saw, the Pennsylvania Constitution protects all public natural resources. And even the Justinian version that we heard about from Roman common law protected the air. Today, in the 20th century, there's been a concerted effort to extend public trust principles to apply to the atmospheric commons to protect it against private expropriation as a sink for greenhouse gas pollution. There have been some successes. Massachusetts enacted an integrated climate change strategy in response to one of these suits. Hawaii, there's a settlement with the Department of Transportation. There have also been a number of failures. For example, most famously, the recent Juliana versus United States kids climate case, attempting to partner a public trust claim with a due process claimed right to a livable climate, which did not succeed. Where the action is in this department is really in state constitutions right now, where public trust principles are being partnered with other forms of environmental rights in some interesting ways in Montana, in New York, and in Hawaii. But I don't have time to tell you about that. If we could go to my last slide, what I want to tell you about is the last kind of area of uncertainty. we see different legal theories about the underlying nature of the trust, at least for common law versions of the trust. The question is it a generic expression of the police power, an ordinary common law susceptible to legislative abrogation like other common law? Idaho is an outlier that has taken that approach. Most states that have confronted this have followed the California approach, treating it more as a quasi-constitutional constraint on sovereign authority that the legislature can't just legislate its way out of. If the legislature could just legislate, no, we're not constrained, not much of a constraint. There's also some ongoing evolution about whether or not the public trust can be used as a background principle to defend regulations against regulatory takings claims. This usually arises when claims are made against regulations protecting public access to trust resources or preventing tideland or wetland construction within them. And we've seen some courts, states, and circuits split. New Jersey, South Carolina, and the Ninth Circuit have all allowed the background principle defense. Texas has shown hostility, some federal courts of claims as well. But the big question I want to finish on is there a federal public trust obligation? There's a robust scholarly conversation that says there's no legitimate historic or logical reason to distinguish between the state public trust obligation and the federal sovereign obligation. But the Supreme Court recently said no, about 10 years ago, in dicta in PPL Montana, suggesting no, it is only a state obligation. So it would take some heavy lifting to change that view, but it highlights the importance of both state and federal roles in protecting the coastal zone, as the Coastal Zone Management Act anticipates, because while states are bound by this obligation and have this authority to protect the coastal zone, every state can only protect its own. So we need federal leadership and partnership in allowing the interjurisdictional coastal resource to be protected from one state to the next. And with that, I will turn the floor over to my co-panelists.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks so much for sharing that fascinating history of the evolution of the public trust doctrine in the United States. We could talk all day about that. So before turning things over to our next panelist to provide some current examples of the public trust doctrine at work in state coastal management, we did want to take a minute to highlight the national scope of this conversation by presenting a teaser of research that the National Sea Grant Law Center has been conducting in partnership with the Coastal States Organization. For those who may not be familiar, the Law Center is one of the 34 Sea Grant programs supported by the NOAA Sea Grant Program. We are unique in the network in that we are not state-based, but rather established to provide legal research, education, and outreach services across the entire network. So I just encourage you to visit our website if you'd like to learn more about our work. And on behalf of the entire Sea Grant Network, I would like to thank all of your offices for the bipartisan support the Sea Grant program has received in the recent appropriation processes. Next slide. So last year, due to conversations that the CSO and the Law Center were having about the public trust doctrine, we started to wonder what courts had been saying about the public trust cases or about the public trust doctrine over the past 30 years or so. And it turns out they've been talking about it a lot. Next slide. One of the Law Center's postgraduate law fellows undertook a word search of state court cases published since 1997 that mentioned the term public trust doctrine. We were floored by the initial search, which returned over 2,000 hits, but we were able to narrow it down to 500 relevant cases, but they came from 43 states and 2 territories. And so this chart just shows the distribution of cases across the country. And not surprisingly, New Jersey and California have a lot of cases, but there were some states that we didn't expect, like New York and Pennsylvania, where the public trust doctrine is applied in non-coastal contexts to protect public parks or other inland resources. Please note, this is an inventory's work in progress. We just wrapped up a state comment period. These numbers will likely change as we review and clean up our data and work to making this inventory more accessible in the spring. But next slide, one last sneak peek I wanted to share is that we looked at the distribution of cases over time. And while we do see some spikes in activity, there's usually at least 10 court opinions issued every year. And so I think this really reveals that the public trust doctrine is an active area of law and, legal discussion in the courts, and that's why it's extremely relevant for state policy and decision making, right? This is a doctrine that is being used by both the state and the public or private challengers to kind of wrestle with the coastal management problems that are facing us today. And so with that, I'm excited to turn it over to Christine Goebel to share some recent North Carolina experiences.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Christine Goebel. I'm an Assistant General Counsel with the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and I have been representing our Division of Coastal Management for the last 22 years here in North Carolina. And I'm excited today to talk to you about the North Carolina's Threatened Oceanfront Structures Interagency Work Group, which took place in 2022 and through 2024. Next slide. So no doubt you've seen the news footage of at least a few of the 11 houses which have collapsed in the North Carolina Outer Banks since 2020. These houses are on inholding lots that are within the larger bounds of the Cape Hatteras National Seashore, mostly around the village of Rodanthe. Rodanthe is about 25 miles north of the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. This area of the Outer Banks has the highest long-term average annual erosion rate in North Carolina at about 13 feet per year long-term. Of course, localized erosion can be at a higher rate than that, but very high rates long-term. Based on 2020 imagery, our staff found that 750 of the 8,777 structures in North Carolina oceanfront were at risk, which meant that there were no dunes or oceanfront vegetation between them and the ocean. So this is a real issue. The houses that were falling in did meet the applicable oceanfront erosion setbacks when they were built, but they were built in the 1980s and 90s, and erosion has taken place since then to make them now non-conforming or threatened. Many of these collapses are not tied to hurricane activity. They're happening during nor'easters or even just high swells during full moons or new moons. This situation is a lot based on the fact that FEMA doesn't pay claims unless the house is taken by the ocean. And so that's why these houses are sort of sitting there and waiting on their pilings until something happens. Unfortunately, this debris field, when they do collapse, it's a debris field of everything. You can see the wood in the pictures, but you've got glass from the windows, you've got the tar paper from the roofs, you've got insulation, you have any of the belongings left in the house, you have the contents of a sewer system. So all of that quickly stretches miles up and down the beach. So when these started to happen, the Seashore's first step was to ask owners to sort of pre-coordinate debris removal companies to try and wrestle with the debris in a timely fashion. Next slide. There was a stakeholder forum about this issue in August of 2022. And following that, the Seashore Park Superintendent named Dave Halleck and the Division of Coastal Management Director at the time, Braxton Davis, established an interagency work group to engage with partner organizations and stakeholders to identify research and recommend policy or program improvements to address these structures at imminent risk of collapse. There are 32 members that you can see on the slide here from local level government, state and federal government, as well as CSO and NOAA OCM. We were very focused on dealing with just these at-risk homes and what to do to address them before they fall in, because this should have been a preventable solution. There should be a preventable solution where we don't have to wait till the houses fall in. Next slide, please. There were 6 meetings total over a year and a half. There were 3 sort of internal planning and discussion meetings just for the work group members, and then 3 public meetings focused on 3 specific issues. The first was about financial assistance options. The second was about the role of public and private insurance. And then finally, the third one was about legal and regulatory authorities. And this included the public trust discussion. Next slide, please. So we looked at property ownership issues and public trust issues. Those kind of can intertwine a bit. We looked at the question of whether the public trust doctrine is a tool that the state could use to require relocation of these structures before they fell in. We looked at lessons learned from a series of Nags Head contested cases where the local government of Nags Head was trying to use the public trust doctrine, and the North Carolina court said that only the state could, that local governments did not have that power. We looked at authorities that could be used to require owners to deal with debris, such as littering. And looked also at what were possible new authorities or innovative frameworks that could be used proactively to address these threatened structures. In this case, the ownership issue was really pretty unique. The federal ownership of this land is tied to deeds from the state to the feds to set up the National Seashore, which was the first National Seashore in our programs. And that their ownership was tied to the mean low water mark. And so they owned, I believe it's the first 200 feet from the mean low water mark. And so as erosion happened along the way over these 30 years or more, the structures that had not been on federal land were now on federal land. And this provided more authority for the seashore to hold owners accountable for the debris removal costs and through kind of a littering mindset. Next slide. So the work group worked for about 1.5 years and then produced a report that was finalized in 2024. That report is available both on DEQ's website and also the Park Service website. The main thing that came out of that was 11 ideas for consideration to move forward on this issue at all levels, local, state, and federal, and many of which required that cooperation between local, state, and federal governments to implement them. 3 of them are now moving forward. Next slide. So recommendation number 2 talked about acquiring these houses to remove them before they've collapsed in. And in 2023, 2 homes located on East Beacon Road in Rodanthe were purchased by the federal government, by the Park Service. They were used, the Park Service used non-taxpayer money from 2 sources, the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That was established by Congress in 1964. The money is from offshore energy leases, as well as the National Park Trust. That's like an NGO friends group for the park system. And with that money, they purchased 2 houses, but not the land because that was already owned by the Park Service, to demolish the threatened cottages. They paid the appraised value of the 2 structures, again, not the land. Those structures had already been condemned, so the prices weren't astronomical. As you'd imagine, a lot of the value of these would come from the land and not these old structures. They paid the removal costs, and this was viewed as a mitigation pilot program. It took just 15 days to remove these 2 cottages and to restore the beach for the use by the public of this Park Service asset. So that was one new thing to try. The next slide, please. Recommendation number 6 was to add proactive strategies to the flood program to remove these cottages before collapse. The work group co-chair Braxton Davis and DCM staff provided information to the North Carolina congressional delegation about this issue and about possible changes to the NFIP, including programs that were similar to the what was called the Upton-Jones Amendment back in the 80s and 90s. That program allowed claims for imminently threatened structures as well as those that had collapsed, but that program was ended in 1994. So after those communications with our congressional delegation on May of this year, Representative Murphy from North Carolina introduced HR 3161 with several co-sponsors and help from the Coastal States Organization for that legislation. It would amend the NFI or the National Flood Insurance Act to allow demolition or relocation before collapse. So again, going back to that imminent collapse idea. For those houses covered by NFIP policies. Next slide, please. And then Suggestion number 4, local governments establish their own buyout or financial assistance programs. Dare County, which is the sort of northern part of the Outer Banks area, is having an interest meeting coming up next month. This is to educate property owners about this issue of collapsing houses and what options are available to them, and also including information on the FEMA hazard mitigation grant program that's available in Dare County. It would encourage those interested to sign a voluntary interest form for possible future structure elevation if and when funds are allocated. So trying to educate the property owners of Dare County about their different options, including potentially that FEMA program. Next slide. So I just wanted to share this as a great example of interagency cooperation at the local, state, and federal levels, and would be happy to answer any questions. And there's my contact information. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jill Andrews, and I'm joining you today from Brunswick and the Golden Isles. I represent the Georgia Department of Natural Resources Coastal Resources Division, which houses the Georgia Coastal Management Program, or Georgia CZM. I've been with the program since 2001, and I currently serve as the program chief. I'm also the immediate past chair of the Coastal States Organization. My remarks today will focus on the role of the states, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and Congress in upholding the public trust through coastal management. Mine is going to be more of a story of partnership for public trust and less about the legalities of public trust doctrine. Next slide. The National Coastal Zone Management Program is made up of 34 state and territory coastal programs who partner with NOAA to protect, restore, and responsibly develop coastal communities and resources. The CZMA was passed in 1972 to empower states to manage their coastlines to their full authority and fulfillment of a national priority. It set participation requirements for the program, but also gives states the flexibility to tailor management approaches that meet local needs, while NOAA maintains a national framework and also approves all of our programs. NOAA and the states share a 50-50 funding partnership, where for each dollar invested by the federal government and Congress in program implementation, states are leveraging an equal amount of funding and often much more. And so while states do differ across the country, what we all have in common is that we convene our coastal resource stakeholders, and especially our federal agencies, using the CZMA's Federal Consistency Authority. Next slide. Georgia has been a part of the CZMA network since the 1990s, and public trust resources are what we work on. It's essential to our area of responsibility. Though our coastline is only 105 miles long, we manage nearly 3,500 miles of tidal shoreline and 370,000 acres of protected salt marsh. Georgia has 14 barrier islands and only 4 are accessible by car. 11 of them are under private or public conservation, which demonstrates our state's extraordinary commitment to protecting resources in a way that many others have not. Next slide. Georgia CZM is the trustee of the state's coastal public trust resources, including all of the beaches and all of the areas subject to the tide. We manage these resources on behalf of the public, and our mission is to balance the development with resource protection for our current and future generations. Our mission is tightly aligned with the CZMA's core purpose. I wanted to go through just a few examples of how we enact the public trust through coastal management. So if we go to the next slide. So balancing public uses and managing conflicts is a routine activity for us day to day. And a clear example of this was demonstrated in the startup of the oyster aquaculture industry. Georgia entered this space later than our neighbors, so we have the time to learn from their experiences that have been slowed by coastal use conflicts, a lot of neighbor and oyster conflicts. We started our industry first by figuring out how we're going to locate these things. We started with the Army Corps of Engineers because they co-manage these tidal areas with us. We sat down to develop siting criteria for appropriate locations for oyster farming zones. By bringing in the Army Corps from the start, they then brought in those agencies that they use through their usual consultation processes like Coast Guard and National Marine Fisheries Service. And then we brought our local fisheries and residents to the table. And by doing so, we were able to give consideration to more public uses and resource values than we would have come up with just on our own. I'm happy to say that today we've created 3 aquaculture zones in Georgia with 9 permitted growers and 0 known user conflicts. Our oysters are on the market, and we've built an industry grounded in public trust principles. Next slide. We also balance public trust concerns routinely through our coastal permitting processes. Whether we're permitting for docks, bridges, or access to tidelands, our citizens are expecting their interests in coastal resources to be valued equally or better than the project. Under Georgia's CZM state laws, all permitted projects must be minimized and must pass a public interest test, showing that it has avoided unreasonable effects on resources, public uses, and wildlife. Some of the regular permittees that come through our door include the Georgia Power and the rest of our utility companies, our Ports Authority, Georgia DOT, local governments, as well as hundreds of waterfront homeowners. Thanks to CZMA funding, we have staff and expertise to ensure projects, whether they're big or small, public infrastructure, or in someone's backyard, can minimize impacts while maximizing public benefits. A relatable example that I wanted to share is our work with Georgia DOT on the bridge replacement projects over tidal waterways, of which there have been a lot of recently. These projects do have major impacts on the environment, which are justifiable and typically minimized. But as the resource trustee, we still work with them to find ways to offset impacts. For example, repurposing old bridges as artificial reef materials, or using old bridge approaches as public fishing piers, as examples of some of the outcomes that we strive for when we're working through regulatory processes and balancing public trust. Next slide. The CZMA's Federal Consistency Authority is our secret ingredient to balance the federal and state responsibilities for public trust in the coastal zone. What that authority is doing is promoting early coordination and resulting in better overall outcomes. For example, we are right now working with the Army Corps and the Department of Navy on a 50 to 80 year future sediment management plan for the Kings Bay Naval Submarine Base. And together we're exploring options like building islands for shorebirds, restoring marshes, and improving recreation that helps Kings Bay manage their sediment load and provides publicly beneficial uses. Some of these are out-of-the-box concepts that we're co-developing together, and by being in this space early on, that's going to help Kings Bay ease their way through the state regulatory process down the road for project implementation. Also, federal consistency is really about relationships, and some of those relationships are particularly strong. For Georgia, it's with the Army Corps of Engineers, and by working together, we have the opportunity to partner on a project called the Noise Cut Restoration Project. I want to point it out. It's the photo there on the right with the rock sill and the barge. This had been a long time priority for the Army Corps to reverse impacts to downstream property owners from historic navigation cuts. The Corps had funded feasibility and design plans, and the state was able to secure additional funds to enable construction for that project. And then we also used our CZMA allocated funding to help support research and monitoring post-construction. And the project has already restored downstream navigation and fish habitat in surrounding creeks. Next slide. These examples, I hope, are reflecting how the CZMA enables states to uphold public trust. The Act maintains that balance between state authority and national priorities, and together we've sustained healthy, economically vibrant coastlines for over 50 years. The states are concerned, and we're very grateful for FY25 funding and hopeful for FY26. But funding is flat, and the challenges on the coast are becoming more and more complex. We're also concerned about recent legislation that might eliminate federal consistency altogether, ending 50 years of successful coordination and collaboration. But we don't believe that federal consistency is a roadblock. Instead, it's a bridge for states and federal agencies to share problem solving and public trust protection. And I hope these examples help sort of demonstrate that for you today. And last slide. The partnership between the states and the federal government through the CZMA works, and it needs continued congressional support. So that's where your role comes in. Without funding, the system breaks. Without federal consistency, we lose a key tool for aligning federal and state coastal priorities. The states are committed to coastal management, and we hope that Congress is as well. I wanted to close with a message that I saw from the commander of the Army Corps of Engineers, Savannah District, who was at a conference with me last week. I put his final slide up here on the screen for you. It reads, "Together, everyone achieves more." And the example that he used is the same example of our collaboration on noise cut restoration as I shared with you today. And he shared that to a room full of environmental professionals from across the country. And for the record, I did plan to use that example before I saw his. But I agree, together we have achieved more, and we will continue to do so. And if you don't want to take it just from me, you heard it from the Army Corps of Engineers too. The CZMA matters and it deserves your full support for the public trust. Thanks for having me today.
Well, thanks again for all of our panelists for all their great presentations. And now I believe we will turn it back over to the organizers for a Q&A session, or if there's any, just general questions for the panelists or other discussions. So Miranda, I don't know.